Okay, let's get back to what the cross changes, and what it doesn't change. All right, was there any getting our minds back into this arena? Were there any questions or input? This is the interaction part of our night. So let's kind of get our minds going. So did the cross change ethics?
No.
So in other words, if adultery was wrong here, would it be wrong here?
Yeah.
Well, I thought I wasn't under the law.
Obviously, some people think that too.
Are you following me?
Yeah.
Well, but it didn't change God's at the cross. Now, again, what was written on stone is now written on hearts. Okay? Now, let me throw you a little curveball. Because this is where I will change, and I won't follow everything a Reconstructionist may teach, all right? And you'll see as we get along the way. Repercussions. Do repercussions change because of the cross? Yeah, see, you're all going, oh, absolutely. Praise God they cross. Because, well, for several reasons. Number one is he took upon judgment, didn't he? So while we will stone the adulterer under an old covenant, and again, if you caught your spouse in adultery, you'd like to be an old covenant believer, wouldn't you? But when we get here, adultery is still wrong. But we're not throwing the same stones.
Jesus actually took it further and said that adultery, when you look at somebody with
Your heart, yeah, you
just
commit.
having a physical,
Right, because if that were true, then we should be stoning everybody. Because I don't know anybody that hasn't sometime in their life had this glitch. There ain't nobody that pure. And so repercussions do change. And he showed it when they threw the woman in front of him, and he said, let him who is among you without sin cast the first stone. Now listen, he wasn't advocating for adultery. He wasn't saying, this is cool. Live like you want. No, he wasn't saying that. The repercussion changed. Okay? And so you will find the repercussions of the new covenant oftentimes will be different. There's a different way of handling sin because here, well, let me put it to you this way. Where God seemingly allowed man, and of course man corrupted, didn't he? Justice anyway. They were throwing stones at everybody. I mean, there was a real corruption. I'm not saying that unrepentant adultery will not cause death. It just won't cause death at the hand of man. You see, you can't violate God's laws and think you're going to get away without any repercussion. In other words, if you were caught, let's just go, if you were caught in homosexuality, the repercussion under the Old Testament was stoning. So there would be some that might advocate that being a capital crime. I would not be one of those that would advocate that's a capital crime. Why would I not advocate that to be a capital crime? It's because the repercussion was changed through the cross to where Paul said in Romans, all of nature bears witness against it. God himself bears witness against it. And what happens is, and unfortunately what has taken place in that community, but there's no eyes to see, is that there is a shortening of the longevity of their life. We don't have to throw stones. The sin itself produces death. The wages of sin is what?
Death.
Right. And we're just not talking spiritual death. I mean, you've watched people that have lived hard, sinful lives, and they'll die 20, 30, 40 years early than they should have. Do you not think but that's out of our hands. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so if you're saying what caused death, which is not death by man, what about the death penalty?
Right. Well, we're dealing with capital punishment. Now, again, when we get to murder, and Jesus didn't take away, he will have affirmed some things with regards to government and the sword and protection and justice, but even that has a process. In other words, this may not have been wrong, but there was a capriciousness that took place, and again, murder has its own, it was an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, and there was a sense of justice that had to take place, and that's still allowed within the context of a new covenant. That's a great question, though. Why would that one then still exist? But even that one exists through an incredible appeals process. And, you just can't, even if you saw him with your own eyes shoot somebody, you just can't grab him and go kill him. I mean, there's an appropriate way that goes through. But that's a great question. And we may have to explore that one a little bit more because, but of course, I will say this. Let me go back to this point because I've thought through capital punishment. I have no problem with capital punishment, but my problem is, I will go back, is its application currently in America. I think it's applied more to those who have no resource than those who have resource, who can avoid certain justice. So you know what, I might back up and simply say there might be even some areas in capital punishment that I might squint at because of the way it's applied currently in our culture. It's not done very well currently. I mean, I think I'll just say I think there's too many African American males that find themselves in that predicament of a capital crime, and I think they're there. In my opinion, not so much because of a racial issue, but an economic issue, is that they don't have the resources others do that get to wiggle out of those areas and they can buy justice. So I have some application trouble. But that's not to say it's still not valid within a biblical framework. So if someone says, Pastor Baird, are you for the death penalty? Because I'll get asked that if I'm debating abortion. If I believe that life is sacred, then why do you believe in capital punishment? Well, because this life is innocent, this life is guilty. And so it's not apples and oranges. But it's a great question. Okay. All right, so the repercussions do change. So when you get, if you continue reading in this area, I'd simply caution you to keep that in mind with regards to how the cross does mitigate some things as we go through there. Anything else on this particular area, or we may? All right. And everybody's ready to study eschatology next class session in the first of the year. Well, we will do that. All right. I want you, if you have your DeMar book, I want to begin to develop. This is our comment area. Okay, so we got to start visiting a little bit on this area. But I'm looking in chapter 4 of Ruler of the Nations. Chapter 4 of Ruler of the Nations. And I want to begin to talk about the concept of collective responsibility. How many of you got into chapter 4 or have read through chapter 4 of Ruler of the Nations? Just can you wave at me so I know whether or not who all maybe can enter into a discussion here with regards to that. All right, let's talk about collective responsibility, and I will get to our God and Government book here in just a moment, as God is supreme ruler. But I want to have just a moment because this is another area that can bring some confusion to people, especially in our current age that we're living in. Currently in an Americanized Christianity, we predominantly preach a message that has to deal with personal or individual redemption. Do you understand what I mean by that? I mean, we're, and there's nothing wrong with this. But the gospel has been, I call it, reduced. It's been reduced to personal or individual redemption. What do I mean by that? I mean that when we're preaching the gospel, we're basically got our crosshairs shooting at people, wanting them to give their hearts to Jesus, get your life right. Along with that, any ethic that comes out of that is mostly a personal or individual ethic. In other words, and that's called discipleship. In other words, they're saved or they're born again, and we're trusting we're working with a converted heart that desires the things of God, and you begin to disciple them in the ways of God. In other words, there's certain precepts that you begin to teach them, what it means to walk as this believer. And some of them are positive. You need to read your word, you need to get a prayer life, you need to be in the house of God. There are certain things that we begin to share. You need to lay your hand to something, you need to serve the Lord. There are negative things too, We need to circumscribe our mouths. We need to quit the coarse jesting or the interactions defrauding one another. There's all those one another passages. So understand that for most of America, the gospel is almost exclusively restricted to these areas. And I'm going to be honest with you, this area is even getting shady. With regards to personal ethic. In some, not every circle, some circles. It's almost as if God doesn't care anymore. It's just about redemption and your liberty. Well, okay, that's there is liberty, but liberty is understood under God's authority. Liberty is understood under God is in charge. All right, now, this chapter, and if you haven't read it, I want to encourage you to spend some time in chapter 4. Because here's the concept. If sin has touched us personally, and we know that to be true because how do we all catch sin? We're born with it, and who got it started? Adam, yeah. So we know that sin touches us personally, but do we also believe, and I suspect most of you have been taught well enough to know that sin not only touches us personally, but it touches us culturally, or corporately, or what I think they use the term collectively. Sure it does. You can go to any city, any town, any place in this nation and others, and it won't take you long before you see the effects of sin collectively. Now the question is if sin has touched both arenas, if sin is comprehensive in its nature, then the cross, which is the answer, has to at least be as comprehensive. So the cross deals with us as individuals, but there's also a responsibility for the collective to honor God. Are you following me? So we're to honor God. Now, there's some interesting stories that I don't know we spend as much time on in the Old Covenant as we need to, although I also think you can make this case in the New Covenant, and I want to do this. In the Old Testament, we have several stories that I want to bring to your attention. One is the story of Achan. Do you remember the story of Achan? Who wants to synopsize, raise your hand, the story of Achan real quick for me? You think you could do it? Brad, synopsize that.
They were told not to bring anything back to the camp after destroying, I don't remember if it was Jericho.
Yep.
And he brought back some stuff and stuck it under his tent.
Stuck it under his tent.
And then it was discovered, and then God killed him and his family.
Yeah, yeah. Well, actually, it was Joshua that killed him. You start thinking about that. That's wild. But why? But how did they know something had happened with regards to that? How did they know Achan's house had not handled?
Because there were things that started happening collectively.
Exactly.
What was it?
Well, they went to battle and they lost in a succeeding battle. Now I want you to get a hold of this because this made me tilt the first time, and it really took a while for me to get through this. And that is that God will hold corporately people's destiny can be withheld because of disobedience individually. Now I know your brain is just like mine. Because this is what I want to go to God. I'm saying, you're kidding me.
Because of this joker over here.
Exactly, Anna. Exactly. You're saying, God, that's not fair. Look, you're holding my future up because of
Yeah.
Let's just
that's, what do we say? That's not
fair.
Do what? I'm sorry.
I mouthed you an example of what we had one time.
Oh. Well, I'm sorry. I didn't catch that. Otherwise, I'd use it. But anyway. But that's not fair. It's because that's our Americanized. Now, hear me. Think about how much you're Americanized, because what is the American milieu? It's rugged individualism. Now, I like Rush Limbaugh, but Rush Limbaugh says it all the time, that we are a nation of rugged individualists. In other words, our destiny hinges on no man. We can make a way, and well, all that sounds good, and there is an aspect of the gospel, certainly, of self-responsibility and initiative, and I'm not denying that that's not there. But this is the part that we don't get, and that God works under the concept of covenant. And He not only has a covenant with you as an individual, but He has a covenant with a people. Covenant with a people. Let me give you another example real quick. This is when I first learned it, by the way. This is when it first kind of came to my attention, and when I started to deal with it, I thought, wow, this is not fair. When Moses sent the spies in, and it came back, remember, 10-2. And the two that said, we are well able, you remember who the two were? Joshua and Caleb. We don't even know the names of the 10, do we? Who wants to know their names? But here you go. There are two people who are ready to go slay some giants. But there are 10 people who said, we can't do this. And God restricts the destiny of these two. Now, we don't even know how many people they could have influenced. I suspect they all were influential people that went in there. And I suspect those two could have influenced a few. So why wouldn't the Lord at least allow the two and some that they influenced to go ahead with the will of God? Because destinies are connected together because of a... See, our covenant doesn't only exist... See, that's what we've turned this into very individualized religion. In fact, I'm going to go so far to say that the reason a lot of megachurches work is because they have learned to gather literally tens of thousands of people in such a way that everybody's there individually pursuing what they feel like God has for them, individually. Now listen, now again, this will sound like I'm throwing stones, I'm just making observations. You go to a large church and you'll get a list of potential classes you can go to. You choose. What do you need? What do you think you need? What's interesting is you want to look and you just say, how do they know what they need? They think they need how to be rich in 10 easy steps. And what they need is maybe how to be a husband or how to be a father. I mean, how many people do you know just trip in and say, well, I'm really lousy at this, so I'm going to go to this class. I think women do that more because women are just that way. They want to. Not us men. We're not going to go to anything that we really need. See, my point is, what do you need? What about the free market that says, you like to ride Harleys? Then let's have a group and we'll do a devotional. We'll ride Harleys together.
That's a ministry.
But what does that do? It speaks to the individual. And there's no concept of covenant that exists. That perhaps God gathered us together for a reason. Now I tell you, when it gets down to that, that's really hard. Because Steve, I look at you and I go, wow, my future is linked to you. Now, listen, covenant not only, God set it up in such a way that covenant was not just amongst His people, but covenant had to do with nations. Israel was a covenant nation. In other words, there weren't all, when God judged Israel, you do understand that not everybody in Israel was a rascal. I mean, there was one time, that was it Abraham or Lot? I always get confused when he's like dealing with God, if there be 50 righteous. Remember that? Who was that? Abraham. That was Abraham. And of course, he starts dealing with them by fives until we get down to about 10. And of course, you couldn't even find 10 righteous. But we do know Abraham was righteous, at least to enter into the discussion. And yet God destroys a city even though there are decent people within the group. Why is that? Because there is a covenant that exists. Now, here's the deal. And this is about cultural engagement. Why do we press the truth of the gospel into America? Because
Their future's
Because they're withholding our
and
taxes.
vice versa.
and it's because nations have a covenant. And I believe every nation has a covenant. The nations, the scripture tells us, the nations are an inheritance. Every nation has a covenant. But America, in particular, when you look at our history, we know that when these people came to America, they came and created a covenant. And this nation has a covenant, and because Jesus is Lord of all, every nation has a responsibility to give honor to God, whether or not that nation is saved or not. Now, this is when the brain starts going tilt. Because out there, you're going to have people who will say, don't shove your religion down my throat. Don't you for a moment suggest that you can put your personal ethic on me. But you've got to understand covenant. You see, we don't start with man. Where do we start with? We start with God. See, this is where everything starts with God. God, not with man. We don't pass laws that simply help man. We pass laws that honor. Yeah. Because if you'll honor God, then the rest ends up finding appropriate order or finds its appropriate place. So the issue of judgment and responsibility rested upon both individuals and collectives. Israel was oftentimes judged as a nation despite having righteous individuals. And I mentioned the two stories here. Now, let's go to the New Testament. You say, well, is that New Testament? Well, let me suggest to you it is New Testament. You just go to the book of the Revelation and you just go through the first 7 churches and read that. And he spoke. Who did he speak to? He didn't speak at that point to an individual. Jesus spoke to a collective. He spoke to the church. Now, do you think that church, percentage-wise, has 100% rascals? No. Well, I don't think so either, because in fact, you'll read some of that and he affirms them in some things. But he says, I have this against you. And what's being affirmed there is this covenant that exists again. And I believe covenants exist within a family. The reason families stay is there is a covenant here that honors God. We don't see our culture currently. The reason it shifted to same-sex marriage is because we think marriage is about us. Marriage isn't about us. We think salvation's about us. That's why when you'll hear me say this, and I know everybody says amen, but I hope they're thinking about it. But you weren't saved because your life was a wreck and you're a mess and you just can't handle it anymore. That's not why you were saved. Do you understand that God is, if God was moved by lives that were wrecked and needed help, I mean, He'd intervene. We were saved for the praise of His glory. Our primary reason for being saved is that God is to be honored through our lives, not because you just needed a better life. Now, your life will be better, but understand, we can't make salvation this man-centered thing. It's because I just need a better life. And that's why in this current era I get frustrated, because when people come to Jesus, they'll come to me and they'll say, my life's a wreck. My wife left me, my kids have left me, I've lost my job, I'm addicted to drugs, I've done 5 stints at the rehab, I can't pay my bills, I'm getting kicked out of my house, I need Jesus. And you just want to stop for a moment and you just say, dude, if that's why you're coming to Jesus, then you're coming for the wrong reason. That's why you'll hear me, if there's not brokenness and a contrite heart, if there's not godly sorrow, not because you're a mess, but there's godly sorrow because you've broken the heart of God, then I'm not sure conversion even takes place. I'm just sorry. I struggle with this. Because we've caused it to be man-centered. Same thing happens collectively or in the life of the church. We are called a body. And I believe that God is judging us collectively as the body of Christ. The church is impotent right now. We have no voice anymore in this nation. And it's because the church is out of order. I mean, we talk about there's a liberal branch of this and a conservative branch of that, and I'm talking now collectively, is that we are so out of order in this nation, in our Christianity, that we have no voice. But I believe it boils down to individual churches as well. That there are individual churches that are out of order. And I believe that there can be righteous people that exist within that collective, but that God will deal with the collective. And it is kind of a sobering thought, because I can't control Brad or Steve or Chris or Ted. I can't control you guys. You don't know how many times at night I go, if only I could control, if only they would sign their life over to me. I could fix this. But you can't do that. You cannot do that, you see? But that's why, because we don't teach covenant anymore. I mean, covenant, the last vestige of covenant, and it's almost gone, the last vestige of covenant was the marriage covenant. When we would look at our wives, or if you're a woman, you'd look at your husband in the eye, and you'd begin to say things, for better or for worse, for rich or for poor, in sickness and in health, forsaking all others, cleaving only unto you, for as long as we both shall live. Now, were there reasons to get out? Sure, there were reasons to get out. And the Reconstructionists would even say, in so much as Israel went after whores and God divorced him. Divorce Israel. Now, I realize if you're a premillennialist in here and you believe that Israel has a unique place in the mind of God, that probably causes no small degree of consternation in your mind. But the Reconstructionists would look and say, Israel went whoring after other gods and God divorced them. And they'd point to Matthew 21, where God said in that parable of the landowner, when Jesus said that the master would send his servants, and they kept killing his servants. And then finally, the master says, well, if I send my son, surely they'll listen to my son. And they killed him too. And he's prophesying of his own death. And then Jesus looks at him and he gets everybody torqued off for one last time. And he says, I tell you that I am transferring, he says, God is transferring the kingdom to a nation that will produce the fruit of it. And literally, what the Reconstructionists would say is this, that at that moment, God is divorcing himself from Israel and now has said Israel has no longer become a nation or a race, but it's become a people by grace who have received Jesus Christ. Therefore, Paul would later say in Galatians, you're not a Jew by birth, you're a Jew by new birth. That the seed has now come in you, and you are part of Abraham's seed by virtue of Jesus Christ. So now all the old covenant promises are just as good for you as a Gentile as they are or were for the Jews who were practicing their faith in that day. Now, of course, a dispensationalist says, heresy. Heresy, because God's primary plan is for Israel. Which is why you'll see people interpret passages different ways. I preached the valley. You remember in Ezekiel 38? Is it that the valley of dry bones? 37, 38, somewhere in there? People preach that different ways. Some people preach that as God gathering Israel and causing them to become a new state. Those dead bones. But there are others like me who preach that as God will blow up across His church and bring those. And the question is, who's right? Now, maybe it's layered. Maybe you want to... Yeah, I'm right. Thank you, baby. I appreciate that affirmation. But you see what I'm saying? It affects how you begin to interpret things with regards to that. But covenant, though, is the part that we have missed, the collective. Personalized Christianity is not the whole gospel. And he makes a statement here. I like this statement. He said, individualism results in social antinomianism. Now that sounds really big. Individualism results in social antinomianism. Antinomianism is lawlessness.
What page is that on?
Oh, you had to ask me because I didn't put the page down.
Sorry. Individuals that have, okay. It's all right. I'll find it.
Now,
Probably around 59.
yeah, it's 58, 59 is probably, you're right, somewhere in there. I'm screening through.
87.
Well, I'm heading to page 84. So if
67.
67. Thank you, Ted.
57?
67. For the second paragraph.
Okay.
Okay, and then finally, I want to. We've only got a few minutes till our next break. I'm on page 64 with regards to victimless crimes. Page 64 of Ruler of the Nations. And I want to read to you just a couple of paragraphs here, but listen to this. When we're talking about now you see why do we press our agenda or our values into the culture? Why do we press our values into the culture?
Because there's no new
Government, yeah.
Because there's no neutral, but because you're exactly right. You're both right. There is no neutral. Some worldview will prevail, and the other thing is a covenant that nations are required to honor God. Nations are required to honor God.
Yeah, that's a pretty heavy statement to put that out in the world.
Yeah, really.
But and so you can say that, and they go, "We don't want it. We don't want it." Well, then fine. There's no such thing as neutral. Somebody's worldview prevails, and our job is to go out in the power of the Spirit, reaching both individuals with the gospel, but also pressing our views into the culture. Listen, only about 10 to 20% of the American population actually believed that we needed to enter into a revolutionary war in 1776.
Okay. It's only 10 to 20%.
It was only 10 to 20%. Everybody else, I mean, there weren't a lot of people lining up to fight the greatest superpower of that day. But let's just say 20% of the population had the ability to press the issues of revolution into the culture. At best, 3% of the culture has convinced the rest of us that same-sex marriage is a valid concept. I mean, I still just shake my head to this. 3%. But you know what the problem is? A lot of your friends who would say that they are Christian uphold their right to do that because they've not been taught. They've not been taught a God-centered theology. They've been taught a man-centered theology. They've been taught that redemption is all about them. And of course, they've been taught and affirmed that viewpoint in Babylonian school. And oh yeah, Kaylin. That's a great story. My daughter called the other day. She went to for her first interesting psychology class at a Christian school, college. And gratefully, the professor handled the discussion right.
She stated it right.
But she allowed for this discussion.
Gender confusion.
They were talking about gender confusion that day in a psychology class. So she allowed for the discussion to take place in this classroom, obviously predominantly attended by Christian students. And then Kayla comes out and says to her mom, "We got to talk." And it's because she started hearing her classmates who supposedly grew up in church being taught the Word of God, who are advocating same-sex marriage.
They're not talking about same-sex marriage.
It's
They haven't got that.
No.
They're just saying that, if you're a girl but you just always feel like you're a boy, then it's okay. And they did the whole discussion because she showed a documentary about, I guess this is on the news somewhere, about this little girl. Well, she's 5 years old, and she's not a girl, she's a boy. But all this time, people have been thinking she's a girl, so she's going in the girl's bathroom, and now she's.
It's confusing. That's
Let's
why
just put it that way.
she has it's boy parts Acting like a girl.
So wearing dresses and everything else.
Thinks
And,
of themselves as a
right,
girl.
and she's a boy, and so, you know, the teacher's like, God doesn't make mistakes, as a boy. And that's, and then people are like, no, you know, then they get into the whole thing about, you know, we're fine with little girls wearing pants. Why, this is what this girl, Kayla's like looking at her like, you freak, get away from me. She's like, you know, why are we fine with girls wearing camo pants and a little t-shirt? I mean, why are we think that's cute? But a
Yeah.
little boy can't wear a dress, so now we're like all saying that he's weird because he wants to wear a dress. And Kayla's like looking at her like, you know, what is wrong?
Here, whoa.
with
Now,
you?
but and I'm glad you brought that up, because this is, and we'll take a break and we'll come back and we'll take questions. But now do you understand why God in His Word said that women were not to wear men's clothing? Why might He say that? Because it looks weird to the world. Because there's no gender confusion.
Right. I said so. And so,
So,
she said,
as-
so then they got into the whole. Well, then that's legal. And I said, well, I told her, I said, Kaylin, let's just make it. Look, I just want to say.
No.
The Duggars have no question at their house who the boys are and who the girls are.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now-
I grew up like that.
Now hear me when I say
Wear
this.
dresses.
You know, and ladies can wear slacks, and so we're not going down that road. We're not going down that road. But you understand now maybe what the purpose
Right.
of that law, why that law existed. It was to keep people from being gender confused.
Right.
See, doesn't that now all of a sudden you're going, whoa. That verse is starting to make a little sense to
Yeah,
me
it
now.
wasn't just legalism. Right?
Exactly. I'm glad you brought that up, because that's a good example of why you have maybe something in there that people go, what, that's just stupid. Well, no, now it's not so stupid, is it? All right?